number 2 of this review of Asperger's children, the origins of autism in Nazi Vienna. So as I was saying in my previous video, so I was talking about how autism came into being at a very particular time in history during the Third Reich, when Nazism was deeply obsessed with social feeling and Gemut, the idea of social bonds, and how children and adults who were lacking in this social feeling were given the label autism and were seen as needing to be corrected to make them have this social feeling, and if they couldn't be corrected then they were sent away to their deaths. And Asperger was very much implicated in this. So Asperger himself, as it says on page 84 and elsewhere, actually believed that some of his children were capable of malice. The name autistic psychopathy, which is what the label that the children were given, autistic psychopathy, was given because it was felt that they threatened social order, and psychopathy was the label that was given because it was originally applied in the 19th century to those in asylums and prisons. And Asperger actually said that he wanted to prevent the burdens of their antisocial and criminal acts on the national community. By criminal, by the way, it didn't mean that these were actually criminals, like on our modern day understanding of the word. They were criminals simply because they weren't integrated into the national community, which is horrible when you think about it. And it talks about how, obviously when we think about the Third Reich in that period of history, we often talk about the genocide that was committed against Jews, and other groups. But one form of genocide that is often overlooked was psychiatric genocide. But many, literally thousands of disabled people and people with psychiatric conditions were sent to their deaths, including many autistic people. And Asperger was implicated in that. And also, he actually affirmed sterilisation for those he saw as a burden on a community as well. And this actually exists. This record exists in the evidence, so we cannot ignore it. This actually happened. This isn't a hypothesis. He actually affirmed sterilisation. A very interesting part of the book is the bit where it talks about gendered expectations, because it's well known that autism is diagnosed more frequently in boys than in girls, but this gendered diagnosis actually has its origins way back with Asperger. There's a chapter dedicated completely to girls and boys. Asperger did see some girls, but he did not diagnose them autistic, despite the fact they had similar profiles to the boys, but he didn't diagnose them as autistic. Instead, he focused on their home lives, because he didn't think that school was important for the girls. Whereas conversely, for the boys, the schools referred them. The girls got referred for bad behaviour at home, and the school life was not seen as concerned. So it's like these two perspectives there. For boys, their school life was of concern. For girls, it was their home life. And because what mattered, because of these gender stereotyped expectations, was for girls' competence in private life, domestic duties and personal relationships, whereas boys had to be competent in public life. Things like discipline, achievement and peer integration were seen as most important, whereas the girls' relationships with their families, especially their mothers, were seen to be most important. And Asperger said things such as that they were sadistic, that they showed sadistic malice, primitive spitefulness, calculating naughtiness, which is horrible. Quite a lot of the language he used to describe the kids that he labelled as having autistic psychopathy, really very negative. And there's also a class bias here as well, because as it talks about on page 158, Asperger's definition of autistic psychopathy reflected his admiration of in this case, Fritz and Harrow's family. Fritz and Harrow were two of the boys in his original case studies that he diagnosed having autistic psychopathy. But he admired their family background. To quote Asperger directly, he said that many of the fathers of our autistic children occupy high positions. Autism might be a result of higher class breeding. In many cases, the ancestors of these children have been intellectuals for several generations. So that's an example of positive eugenics. He basically did, like nowadays, some autistic people say, like, oh, autism's the next stage of evolution and stuff, which I can't stand, and it's like, that is a eugenicist thing to say in its first place, and aside from the fact it's a load of complete and utter crap. But this, this kind of adulation of some of the autistic kids that Asperger was treating. He split them into groups depending on the worth that he thought they had. So there's this strong class bias there. Another quote: sometimes it seems as if of their ancestors' former grandeur, only the eccentricity remains. And he was wondering if what was called eccentricity in the upper class child might be deemed a character. The author, Edith Schaeffer, makes the point that she wonders whether if what was called eccentricity in the upper class child might be deemed a character failing in the working class children. For example, Marguerite and Alfred, who had similar issues to the boys, but they were not given a diagnosis of autism, so they were not only girls, but they also came from a sort of working class background. So Asperger actually judged their behaviour far more harshly than he did for boys. And the girls' traits were attributed to menstruation and hormones. And Elfriede was deemed to be ineducable, so she was transferred to be killed. So this shows how some of the children Asperger saw, usually girls or people from like lower class backgrounds, he labelled as kind of being ineducable and described them in really harsh, horrible language, like being sadistic, capable of malice and things like that. Whereas for boys, and particularly those from upper class backgrounds, he saw as having like more worth and was seen as being, should be saved, and he gave them the label autistic psychopathy. So it's very gendered and a class basis as well. Asperger interpreted the boys' relationship difficulties as autistic psychopathy, whereas the girls was seen as hysterical and related to menstrual cycle. So some of the boys, not all of the boys, because not all of them, but some of the boys were put on the favourable side of the eugenicist coin and were seen as, potentially being able to be integrated into the Volk. But Asperger didn't believe that his condition could occur in girls, and that legacy, we're still seeing today, where obviously like boys are like still being diagnosed with autism more than girls, but this began right back with Asperger as well. So he was directly implicated in this kind of myth that autism doesn't somehow occur in girls. Well, yes, it does, but Asperger didn't think it did, and that legacy still exists today. Obviously now we do know that autism can occur in girls, but we're still seeing the fact that obviously girls are far less likely to be diagnosed with autism than boys even today. Because Asperger himself said he said that autistic personality is an extreme variant of male intelligence, which is funny enough exactly what Simon Baron-Cohen went on to say all those years later. It's a load of crap. But yeah, it all began with Asperger. While the girls display similar behaviours as Fritz and Harrow, Asperger interpreted only the boys' idiosyncrasies as signs of superior intelligence. So yeah, very, very gendered and sexist. And it talks about, connected to eugenics, that Asperger used the autism label for some to suggest their humanity and yet for others to deny humanity, so it's incredibly selective. So that same label, autistic psychopathy, could be used to either save kids from being sent to their deaths or to send them to their deaths. So it was very biased and very arbitrary, as indeed the whole of Nazi psychiatry was very biased and arbitrary. Didn't really have any real coherence. It was very much based upon the arbitrary whims of a doctor at a given point in time. And his rhetoric, Asperger's rhetoric, as talked about on page 177, was very much in line with colleagues in Nazi psychiatry. For example, his murderous mentor, Franz Hamburger, which rhymes with Asperger, Franz Hamburger, he said that society must invest in disabled youths and try and integrate them. But it had a very sharp eugenicist hierarchy, so he has a range in levels of ability and social worth, again, which brings to mind sort of high functioning, low functioning thing. And that those at the most favourable end of the range might be superior to normal children even. So again, eugenics. Asperger said that as adults they would perform with such outstanding success, one may even conclude only such people are capable of certain achievements, highly specialised academic professions, often in very high positions. He was trying to argue that the traits were valuable to the Nazi state, and this evidence has been used to kind of like make it out as though Asperger was honourable and like trying to save the children, but when you look at it closely, you can see that it really was all part of eugenics, and it wasn't actually contrary to Nazi ideology as a whole, because Nazi ideology did have this part of Nazi ideology was about treatment, was about education, and they didn't see all disabled children as kind of irredeemable. They did believe that some disabled children could be integrated into the folk, and that some disabled children did have worth, so it was very split. And as I say, this gendered and class bias came into place, gave us a hierarchy of worth. Not all disabled children were seen as equally impaired, so it was often pot luck whether or not a doctor would see you as having worth or not. So that the fact that he tried to save some children does not in any way absolve him of blame, because he also sent many kids to get deaths. And it was Asperger's eugenicist focus on favourable cases that obscured the extent to which he was eugenicist, because he dehumanised those that he saw as less favourable by calling them automatons and things like that. It's horrible. And seeing them as ineducable. If you were seen as ineducable, that was a killing criterion. And then individuality would be completely effaced, unrecognisable as humans. In order to prepare society to tolerate the fact that they were going to be sent to get deaths. So social belonging was a criterion of killing. If you're seen as alien to the community, that could be a sure route to being sent to your death. Death sentence if you're unable to work, if you're in need of continual care, because it was all about social utility and utilitarianism. Also, Asperger did grow more critical of autism over time, and in 1944 Asperger disdained, I quote, "those who go their own way, the autistic who cannot integrate and therefore constantly rubs against the community," and he stated that his clinic was to teach children passable assimilation, to grow up correctly within a community. And Asperger said that the level of Gemut, or social belonging, was one of several factors in deciding a child's sterilisation. It's absolutely horrible. As I've already mentioned, autism and Autism were inverse states of being. The root of fascism, interestingly, by the way, fascio, actually means bundle, group. And the roots of autism mean autos, condition of self, so they were both complete loggerheads with one another. So autism was a direct threat to Nazism and fascism. Sort of in a sense, natural rebels if you're autistic. Don't even need to try. Page 240. So they sort of distinguish